Tonight, I am so excited to talk about Rodman Edward Serling. He was a man who tackled political and social issues at a time where it certainly would not have been popular. He stood for what was right, and he held a mirror up to humanity and demanded that we treated each other better. And starting right now, you're traveling through another dimension. A dimension not only of sight and sound, but of mind. A journey into a wondrous land whose boundaries are that of imagination. Your next stop, the Twilight Zone. Da-da-da-da. With that, let's go into part one, A Creative Childhood Until War Changes Everything. Rodman Serling, also known as Rod Serling, was born on December 25th, 1924 in Syracuse, New York to a Jewish family. His mother, Esther Cooper Serling, was a stay-at-home wife or homemaker, while his father, Samuel Lawrence Serling, had worked as a secretary and an amateur inventor of all things. He did this until his two sons were born. Once his children were born, he took on the profession of a grocer to earn a stable income for his family, and he got into that because that's what his father-in-law had done. After the Great Depression, his father also took up the profession of a butcher. Rod Serling had one brother, Robert Serling, Rod and Rob. He was older than Rod, and he was a novelist and an aviation writer. Mr. Serling spent most of his life in Binghamton, New York, and his parents encouraged his creativity. His father even built a small stage down in their basement where he would put on shows for his family, friends, and even himself. We know a lot about his life through his older brother and his wife. One thing his brother remembered was that Rod could entertain himself for hours by repeating dialogue that he had heard on radio shows, magazines, and movies that he had seen. Another way their father encouraged their creativity was by buying them pulp magazines. They get the name because back from about 1890 to about 1950, they would print these cheap magazines on wood pulp paper, and that's how they got the name pulp magazines, and they would be cheap and affordable for working class people. Mr. Serling's older brother even recounted a time where they had an hour-long trip, and they purposely as a family decided not to answer any of Rod's questions to see if he would just keep talking, and he did. He never once noticed that they weren't responding to him. He just talked himself the whole hour trip. Something I always tell my children, things that will be a strength to you one day can be looked at as a weakness until you get to the place that you need to be in life. And the same was true for Rod Serling. In school, he was looked at like the class clown, and most of his teachers even wrote him off as a lost cause. Until he hit the 7th grade when his English teacher, Helen Foley, encouraged him to sign up for the school's public speaking extracurricular activities. And so he did. He joined the debate team, and he eventually was the speaker at his high school graduation. That it often only takes one person to make a huge difference in someone's life. And a lot of times that is a good teacher. Something important that happened during his time on the debate team was that he became known for being a social activist. He also excelled at tennis and table tennis. He even tried for the football team, but he was only 5'4" tall. They told him he was too small to play football. During his senior year, World War II started, and Rod Serling decided that he wanted to enlist in the Army. He felt like he could go fight and that college could wait. This is when his civics teacher, Gus Youngstrom, stepped up and told him, no, finish high school first because war is a temporary thing. It ends. Education does not. And he asked him, without your diploma, where would you be after the war ends? And the message was heard. Rod actually finished high school, but the very next morning, he went and signed up for the United States Army, which was following in the footsteps of his older brother, Robert. His military career saw a lot of movement for him, but he was ultimately assigned to the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 11th Airborne Division. He eventually reached a T4 rank, and during this time, he also started boxing for entertainment and did pretty well as a flyweight. After about a year, Mr. Serling went from Georgia to California, and it was at that time that he knew he would not be fighting against the Nazis, which is really what he wanted to do. But usually going to California meant that you were going to be fighting against the Empire of Japan. So from California, he went to New Guinea, and from there to the Philippines. From there, he was transferred to the 511th Demolition Platoon. This didn't have a good reputation. It was nicknamed the Death Squad. That was because of the extremely low survival rate of this infantry. country. In fact, the leader of the squad said he must have screwed up or pissed somebody off along the way. And he also didn't think that Mr. Serling had what it took to be in battle. He cited that he often would waste opportunities like reloading his ammunition. He also said that against orders, he would often wander off and sometimes get lost. But ultimately, his time in service would shape the rest of his life. He saw death every day, sometimes at the hands of his enemies, sometimes at the hands of his allies, and sometimes by freak accidents and carelessness. Rod Serling recounted that there was a fellow Jewish private named Martin Levy. Mr. Levy had been delivering a comedic monologue for his platoon, and they were lounging under a tree. While this happened, a food crate was dropped out of the sky and landed on Mr. Levy. He was gone. Rod Serling actually spoke the words for his funeral, and he placed a Star of David over his grave. After that, Mr. Serling served in Manila, where they went block by block to take control back from the Empire of Japan, and the people from the Philippines would sometimes throw parties to celebrate the progress, and during one of these parties, the enemies came and lit up the place. Rod Serling survived war, guys, but he did have a few wounds and injuries. One of them was to his knee, to the point where later in life, his wife said that she had gotten used to the sounds of him falling because his knee would just give out sometimes. And to say he came back was an accomplishment within itself. His unit had a 50% casualty rate. Though Mr. Serling never moved up in rank anymore in the military, he did receive a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, a Philippine Liberation Medal, and more honors from his time. But most of all, he got many of his stories and the final pieces of his outlook on life and ethics and society. Even though the experience left him with PTSD and nightmares, Mr. Serling himself said he was bitter about everything that had happened, everything he had seen, but he really started to write to get these feelings off of his chest. The final thing that war gave Mr. Serling was the GI Bill's educational benefits and disability payment. He took that and enrolled in school in a special program where you would go to school a term and then work a term. During this time, he became active in the college radio station, and as he did this, he started to work past the campus radio and toured the state. He was writing, directing, and acting in radio programs, and it was here that he met his wife, Carolyn Lewis Kramer, affectionately known as Carol. But the funny thing is, when she met him, she refused to date him because he had a reputation. She felt like he was promiscuous around campus. But later, as time went by, she changed her mind and agreed to date him. It was also during this time where he joined the Unitarian Church. A Unitarian Church is a church where you are not required to adhere to really strict creeds or, religious rules. It actually promotes inclusivity and openness. And this makes perfect sense for someone like Mr. Serling because these are the messages that we knew he believed in. While in college and working at the radio stations as part of his work study program, he needed to make money, so he went back to what he knew from the Army, and that was testing parachutes. He would get an average of $50 per jump, and of course you had to survive that. There were a couple of jumps where he got paid much more, like one where he got paid $500. And then he did his last test jump just a few weeks before his wedding to Carol, and it paid $1,000, but the 3 previous testers before him had died testing the parachute. With that, let's go into part 2. Part 2, never give up. Throughout his college career, Mr. Serling worked at radio stations in New York and Ohio, and he would make probably about $25 a week, and he had been attempting to build his own career as a freelance writer to radio stations. But at this time, a lot of radio stations were denying works. One reason is because lawsuits were high, so people would send their work in and they would get a rejection letter, and then they would hear something very similar to their work on the radio station. During this time, Mr. Serling got back denial letters. He would often get cited like, this is not what our audience wants. But finally, on September 10th, 1949, his very first radio program that went national was called Hop Off the Express and Grab a Local. This opened the door for him to get his first writing real job, where he was making $75 a week as what they called a continuity writer. So basically, he was pumping out scripts and selling them. He just never touched them again after that. So one day, Rod Serling submits a script that's about a young boy and a young girl who are ghosts who died in World War II. They would see the train and look in the windows at the passengers and kind of wonder about their everyday lives. It was accepted with heavy changes. So it ended up being an alive boy and girl riding on a train with their uncle, I think. They would visit different towns and kind of get involved with the local people of that town. And it was called Adventure Express. But one day he submitted a script about a boxer, and the radio station actually gave him good feedback. And they said, look, you cannot see a boxing match in a story. Our listeners are mostly women. I don't think this is what they want. But they said, maybe you should shop this to television where this can have more impact. And so that's what he did. Looking back, Rod Serling was known to say that radio had been something that tied him down. He felt like he gave away a lot of good ideas that once it was out on radio, he couldn't exactly go and reuse them or get them back. And then he said, like, I sold my ideas for $50 a week. And if he could do it over again, he said he would not be a staff writer. He also felt like he hit TV at the perfect timing, as the industry was just really finding its roots. One of Mr. Serling's first jobs in television was in Cincinnati, where he was writing some of everything from TV, including the ads. So he would write ads even for those medical remedies, you know. He wrote scripts for comedy duos, and also a lot of television was filmed live. Once his scripts began to sell more, he quit his job because he wanted to be a freelance television writer full time. His wife even recalled that she was pregnant with their first daughter, and she was like, he just up and quit out of nowhere. Now, she did say he had another part-time job, so that would still bring in steady income, but still, my girl was pregnant with their first one. It was also during this time where he got an agent, and that agent convinced him to move to New York. This was after a few moves, because at the time, television was live filmed from New York. Once he moved to New York, this is where he started to gain fame. He was working for a theater program called the Kraft Television Theater that was being published on NBC. One day, they published a story based on Serling's 72nd script. That's right, 72. They had hired a babysitter, him and his wife, and they were heading out. And they let the babysitter know, like, hey, nobody should be calling because we just moved to New York. Nobody really knows us. And as soon as they left, the phone started blowing up. They said hilariously, it never stopped ringing after that. That is because his script called Patterns had aired live and it had blown up, guys. Patterns had been about an older corporate boss type guy. He was running out of ideas, probably getting tired because he had been in this field for a long time. And they had put in a younger, energetic, but loyal guy to be trained to take his place. And he started to feel a type of way, but instead of pushing him out, he recognized the talent in the young man and used him to help push his competition out. The New York Times called the show one of the high points of TV. Louis Shayon from the Saturday Review said in all the years that he had been watching television, he did not recall being so engaged by drama. The show had been a hit with the audience as well, and they scheduled a second running for a month later. That was not something that was done. Baby, they didn't have reruns on demand or streaming, okay? You watched it live or you missed it. But it was so good that they had anticipated that it would be turned into a play or motion picture. Right after this, Rod Serling had gotten so many calls congratulating him, offering him permanent jobs, and requesting novels, plays, television, like whatever he had written. So Rod Serling actually sold a lot of his old works that had been denied, and to his dismay, people started to criticize, like, oh wow, maybe he isn't that good, because some of his old works weren't as good. He wasn't as refined. That's normal to get better with time. But he had sold these works and the people were looking at it like, I don't know, maybe this guy's not that good. Until he wrote Requiem for a Heavyweight for a TV series called Playhouse 90. A lot of TV shows were anthologies back then. A few years after moving to New York, the Serling family packed up and moved to California. The prompt to move to California is because it was during this time where they started to record shows, then air them, unlike just airing them live like they were doing from New York. Once they were recording them, California California's movie scene kind of took off. From the point that they moved to California, this is where they would spend the most time, keeping some of their old homes to visit when Rod and the family would need time alone. While trying to take off in television, he got denied over 40 times, but he kept writing. While he was in college, he would write after class. While he was working, he would spend his evenings writing after work, because sometimes catching a dream takes dedication in the chasing. But now that he was in California, he was ready for success. But even success has its challenges. So let's go to part three. Part three, finding a way to take a stance. As Rod Serling started to see success, he found a new problem: corporate sponsorship. In the early days of television, the corporate sponsors were also your censors and your editors. This meant that they would often scrutinize things, sometimes for reasons like, oh, this might make us look bad as a sponsor. I don't know if the audience will like this. This might be too controversial. To small reasons, like one time Rod Serling had wrote in a script to give me a match, and one of the sponsors was a lighter company, and they were like, no, you got to take that out. So it was quite frustrating. Then in 1956, Rod Serling wrote a play called Noon at Doomsday. It was set in the southern United States, and it was about the lynching, that's when you hang someone, of a Jewish pawnbroker. Even though it was controversial, the real problem came when Mr. Serling did an interview about this story. And he admitted that the lynching and brutal killing of Emmett Till is what inspired that story. Immediately, the sponsor slash editors slash censors changed almost everything about the script. They moved the script up to the New England states. They made it about the killing of a foreigner, not a Jewish man. And they changed most of the things in it. But Rod Serling did not give up. He came back sometime later and wrote a new story inspired by Emmett Till called A Town Has Turned to Dust. And he wrote it for Playhouse 90 this time, but they still made him change it. They made him move it to 100 years before. They made him take out all the interracial dynamics, and then they produced it. This may ring a bell if you have watched The Twilight Zone, because they did do an episode about this. We'll talk about it later. But it didn't matter because people took notice of his convictions. A New York Times reviewer added an editorial note at the end of A Town Has Turned to Dust. He noted that this was a show about racism and bigotry in a small southwestern town. The New York Times also noted that Mr. Serling and Playhouse 90 had to fight executives to get their play aired, and that the theater people of Hollywood had reason to be proud of them. This has snapped a change in Rod Serling. He had decided that he was frustrated. He was tired of having to fight for everything that he wanted to say. He had even referenced the Chrysler building in one of his scripts and had to remove it because Ford was a sponsor. So Rod Serling said, I will start my own company, because he knew this was the only way to do what he needed to do. He said, and I quote, I don't want to fight anymore. I don't want to have to battle sponsors and agencies. I don't want to have to push for something that I want and settle for something second best. I don't want to have to compromise all the time, which in essence is what a television writer does if he wants to put on controversial themes. And boy, do I feel him. And this leads us to the birth of The Twilight Zone. So let's go on to part 4. Let's fast forward. Rod Serling has set out on his own. He is at CBS writing, and he writes what he wants to be the pilot episode for The Twilight Zone. It's called The Time Element. But when CBS gets a hold of it, they have a different idea, and they give this script to a company that you may have heard of, run by Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball, called Westinghouse Desilu Playhouse. And they produce it. It's a story about a man in Pearl Harbor. He has vivid nightmares about the attack, and so he seeks out a psychiatrist. And y'all know Rod Serling was going to have a twist ending. So as the man finishes his sessions, he realized that he is actually deceased and that the psychiatrist is the one having the dreams. But the episode received so much positive attention that CBS agreed to let him go forward with The Twilight Zone. All he needed to do was write a new pilot episode. He also signed a 3-year contract with CBS. Now, there was a stipulation, and that was that in addition to writing Twilight Zone episodes, he also needed to continue to write for Playhouse 90 and for other new ventures that they may be looking for. And Rod Serling knew he had something special. For this series, he fought extra hard to keep his creative control. He immediately decided that he would have a science fiction format because he felt like For the network executives, the sponsors, and even the audience, this would be a less controversial format. And if you watch the Twilight Zone, you'll see this. So instead of talking about race like black and white, let's talk about two different species of aliens, or let's talk about humans versus aliens. Rod Serling will pull from his own life experiences. You will notice a lot of themes about soldiers in war. He also did things about airline pilots. It would be a lot of episodes in the Twilight Zone about pilots crashing and landing on different worlds or even in different times. He also did a lot of episodes about boxing. And for the most part, he stuck to his sci-fi theme so that people would get these messages that would have to make them think. But it wasn't just flat out saying racism. It wasn't saying classism. It wasn't saying it like bam, 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 but it was very much out loud. I can remember things of like child maltreatment and what could happen. I also noticed in a lot of Twilight Zone episodes, especially to be taking place in the early 60s, even the very late 50s, because I think the first episode aired in 1959, the women were abnormally strong. These women were smart. They were thinkers. They made quick decisions. He also would have a crazy wife too, like that nagging woman. One of my favorite episodes with the guy who just wanted to read and his boss made fun of him, his wife made fun of him, and when he finally could just get the chance to read because another war thing, the bomb dropped and kind of ended everything, he stumbled across the library. He's like, yes, I can just read. Then his glasses broke. He couldn't see without them. Nobody wins in war, I felt like, was that thing, but I did like that he had progressive women. I say all that to say he tackled gender roles too. One of my favorite episodes, To Serve Man, which you must go watch if you haven't. Yeah, it was a woman who figured out exactly what the aliens that had showed up were up to. But there were other episodes where he dropped the sci-fi theme and went straight to the point, like one called I Am the Night, Color Me Black. Y'all, the town was so prejudiced and bigoted and racist that a dark cloud had started covering the town. Every time their hate grew, the cloud grew until it covered everything. And then it spread across the world because once you let hate loose, there's no stopping it. Hate is contagious. The Twilight Zone ran for 5 seasons and it had 156 episodes. And here's another little known fact. The Twilight Zone was canceled 3 times during its run. Each time Rod Serling would fight to keep it going because it did have a loyal audience. But even though it had loyal viewers, the numbers weren't extremely high. But the 3rd time CBS canceled it, he chose not to fight it anymore. He had been tired. He had written so many episodes. The 4th season had those hour-long episodes, if you remember. And for the 5th season, they went back to half hours. Out of, I think, 30-something episodes, he only wrote 7, and he let his trusted staff that he had built write the rest. And the 5th season was a really good season. Now, that very last one, I'll never forget it because it was about the kids that kept going in the pool because their parents were fighting, and they probably should have just got divorced, but they were trying to stay together for the kids, which wasn't a good thing. Yeah, anyway, I didn't really like that last episode, but season 5 was on fire because that's when we got Talking Tina. We got a lot of good stories in that season. After Rod Serling finished with the Twilight Zone, he sold all the rights for it to CBS, and he told his wife it was because he felt like it would just eat up a lot of the funds of his small company, and so he sold it. After the Twilight Zone, Rod Serling wrote a lot more things for television, but one of the more successful shows that ran for some years was called Night Gallery. And in the pilot episode is Rod Serling in a poorly lit museum, for it to be a museum, and he does an intro and he's in front of these paintings, and as he uncovers it, he's saying, hey, I'm going to introduce you to 3 macabre tales. Now, Night Gallery had some trouble because the network had decided, I don't understand it, they decided that they were going to put a rotation of shows in this time slot. Back in the day, you knew, let me clock in Wednesday at 7 so I don't miss my show. They decided instead of showing Night Gallery every Wednesday at 7, we're going to put these other shows on sometimes, and then you may come back in 2 weeks and then Night Gallery is back on. One of the shows they put was like a comedy. Rob, he said it's not working because this is like putting Edgar Allan Poe on and then putting Flip Wilson on for 34 seconds. They just don't mix, right? They're both good, but they don't mix. And so it was at this time that Rod Serling said, I'm tired of being an executive. I'm going to take a step back. I'm just going to be a writer. Let other people run the show. He did later regret that decision, but I understand how he came to it. But Night Gallery ultimately ran from 1969 to 1973. And when it went into syndication, they combined it with another show called Sixth Sense, so they would have have enough episodes for syndication, and they paid Rod Serling $100,000 to come and voice the intro for the episodes. Rod Serling continued to write. He also would teach classes so that he could pass on his knowledge and his trade and even his convictions. And I have to talk about this screenplay he wrote in 1972. It was based off of a book by Irving Wallace called The Man. He casted James Earl Jones, the late, the great James Earl Jones, who started as a senator in New Hampshire in this screenplay and book. He went on to be president pro temp of the Senate and then ultimately the president of the United States. That's right, Rod Serling wrote a black man as president of the United States. A few years after that, unfortunately, Rodman Edward Serling passed away at the age of 50 years old. He was known to smoke 3 to 4 packs of cigarettes a day. He actually had a heart attack on May 3rd, 1975, and he was hospitalized. He spent a couple weeks in the hospital and they released him. But once he was released, 2 weeks later, he had a second heart attack, guys. This prompted the doctors to do open heart surgery, which was not the go-to at the time because it was highly risky. And unfortunately, while they were doing this open heart surgery, he had a third heart attack on the operating table during the 10-hour-long procedure. He died 2 days later at Strong Memorial Hospital in Rochester, New York. They held a memorial for him at Cornell University's Sage Chapel, where his daughter Anne was one of the speakers. And with that, let's go into part 4, my final thoughts. Part 5, my final thoughts. Guys, I chose to do Rod Serling because I was put on to the Twilight Zone as a young girl. My mother would watch them, and I mean binge watch them because, y'all, when I was a kid, they didn't have on demand. We didn't have any of those features, certainly not streaming. So what would happen is every New Year's Eve, New Year's, the 4th of July, sometimes Memorial Day too, and Labor Day, they would do Twilight Zone marathons. And we would literally wake up to Twilight Zone, go to sleep to Twilight Zone, and get up in the morning back to Twilight Zone. And so I saw most of the episodes starting as a young girl. Later in life, they continue to run those marathons. If you've never checked out the Twilight Zone, I would encourage you to do so. But the Twilight Zone stuck with me because even as a young kid, I could recognize those themes of not trying to be like everyone else, like in the episode called Eye of the Beholder, themes of re-examining prejudices and racisms and gender roles. This was ahead of its time. And it is interesting that now the Twilight Zone has a cult following because I believe as younger generations discover it, they'll see just how ahead of its time it was. There are a few shows that hit me like this where I'm like, whoa, this show was made and they were so far ahead of their time that were they effective then? Absolutely. But they will have an impact for years to come. And this is absolutely one of those times. Rod Serling was a man who stood on his convictions. There were times that he would not let things go. Like when he wanted to do his show that was based on Emmett Till's horrendous murder. Rod Serling also teaches us what it's like to work hard for your goals and not give up. He was denied 40 times in writing. He was turned down far more than that. He wrote far more scripts than you would ever see displayed on Night Gallery or on the Twilight Zone. But those themes that he talked about will live on. He didn't give up. He kept pushing on. Even when he couldn't get it done, he decided, hey, I will step out and start my own thing and have it so that I can say the things that need to be said. Even later in life, when he got tired of leadership, and I understand that too, because sometimes you just want to do a good thing, but there's so much red tape put in front of you to stop you from doing that you get tired of leading. And even once he stepped away, he regretted that later. It doesn't change the fact that Rod Serling made a huge impact. He made a huge statement that will continue to be made, continue to live on. He talked about those social issues, those political issues. He talked about things that people were not talking about on television at that time. And that's why I have always been interested in his work and who he was as a person. The further research that I found with his trauma from the war, the things that he saw and lived through, makes me understand him a little bit more as a man, as a human. And I hope that you got something out of this too. And that's where we're going to end this episode about Rod Serling. I hope you enjoyed it. And until next time, remember, keep learning, be happy, and always have a blessed day. Bye bye.